Hello, thanks for coming. In my book in progress, I document 50 history musicals and closely analyze a core repertoire of about 25. I began to notice a pattern. More than half of history musicals fictionalize or invent love stories, which raises the question, why do creators of history musicals believe romances are so essential that they invent them even when they're devoted to historical accuracy in other aspects of the show? I define history musicals as those that aim to depict mostly true stories about the past and feature mostly real historical figures who were not singers and dancers. The more common subgenre of show business biographies work differently because there's much less cognitive dissonance when the characters burst into song. History musicals are promoted and received as nonfiction, but all history musicals, like all historical entertainments, are fictionalized to some degree. If we ask how and why those choices are made, rather than just debunking fact and fiction, the answers can be revealing. Setting aside the phenomenon of historical figures singing and dancing to present-day musical styles, the subgenre's most common reason for departing from historical accuracy is to fictionalize romances. These inventions are significant not only because they reveal how the creators project their own modern-day constructions of gender and sexuality onto the past they're representing, but also because romances are the reason for the existence of female characters in many of these male-centric narratives. The degree to which history musicals fictionalize romances varies. In many cases, a relationship did actually exist in some way, but the musical has altered documented facts. On the other end of the spectrum, the romances are totally invented and involve creating one or more characters out of whole cloth, usually the women, changing historical details so much that they're now unrecognizable, or otherwise conjuring up a love story where none or an entirely different one reportedly occurred. For the sake of time today, I'm condensing these categories as the motivations behind them are the same. Why do so many history musicals fabricate love stories? I'm going to discuss two reasons. First, to make historical events that are otherwise unconventional subjects for musicals conform with genre expectations, allowing for conventions like primary and secondary couples, love triangles, marriage tropes, and well-worn song types such as love duets and sentimental ballads. And second, to humanize and heroize great men by depicting them as virile and desired by women, whereas the women are often reduced to stereotypical muses or long-suffering wives. In the few female-centric history musicals, double standards come into play, and fictionalized affairs paint the lead women as manipulative instead of heroic and abnormally promiscuous rather than relatable. Today, I'll draw examples from just a handful of shows that have prominent fictionalized romances to represent a much larger phenomenon. Fiorello, Ben Franklin in Paris, 1776, Hamilton, Evita, and Onward Victoria. In recent years, members of the asexual community have introduced the term allonormativity to refer to the way our culture centers sexual and romantic attraction. The prefix allo means other, so allosexuals are those who regularly experience sexual or romantic attraction to others. Much like heteronormativity, allonormativity dominates our society, assuming that everyone enjoys stories about romance, and this is readily apparent in our entertainment media. In her book, A Natural History of the Romance Novel, Pamela Regis writes that in literature of all genres, quote, love plots of various kinds are the norm rather than the exception, end quote. And this is very much the case in musical theater. Fictional musicals are most often structured by the ups and downs of heteronormative romances. History musicals, on the other hand, usually either tell biographical stories or they're about historical events that involved many people, and romances are rarely the central event or structuring narrative. Most history musicals have been centered on male subjects and events framed as primarily influenced by men. This is in contrast to fictional musicals, which frequently have female protagonists. History musicals inherited their patriarchal orientation from the discipline of history, which for millennia took men, particularly political and military leaders, as the subjects of history and saw women as outside of and largely irrelevant to its unfolding. For centuries, great man historiography, or history from above, held sway, and the subjects considered to be of interest to historians were leaders whose personal qualities, whether good or bad, were thought to have shaped the world. Great man history focuses on how the public politics and private life events and personalities of individual leaders destined them to be at the center of major events. Tales of their childhoods and romantic relationships are used to humanize the subjects by giving a glimpse into their private lives. Thus, women in great man histories are often confined to minor maternal and romantic roles, only mentioned insofar as they supported the man at the center. Historiographer Sarah Mazza writes that before the rise of women's history in the 1970s, quote, the assumption lingered that women in the past had lived outside of history, helpful auxiliaries at best. They inhabited a politics-free private sphere. End quote. During the late 20th century, women's and social history, or history from below, gained prominence in the academy. However, great man history remains favored by the general public, who clamor for it in best-selling biographies and in popular historical entertainment. History musicals, as a form of popular history, roughly follow these historiographic trends, but have lagged behind. They didn't begin to shift away from great man mode until the 1990s, and show no signs of abandoning it, as Hamilton's popularity attests. The majority of history musicals focus on men, and women orbit around those men as their wives and mothers and lovers. Whereas male characters are based on robust historical accounts and biographies, women are often thinly drawn stereotypes. Let's turn now to the first reason so many history musicals invent romances, to fit unconventional subjects into Broadway conventions. Musicals are a highly conventional genre. They're often anchored by two romantic couples, forming what Stacey Wolf calls, quote, a quartet of contrasting representations of masculinity and femininity, end quote. And of course, love triangles are everywhere. These conventions date back many centuries. History musicals have an uncomfortable relationship with the conventions because they must navigate a tension between the private sphere romantic and comedic tendencies of the genre as a whole versus the serious political focus of most of their subjects. This tension can be remedied by inserting love stories. The romances in Fiorello, with music by Jerry Bach, lyrics by Sheldon Harnick, and book by Jerome Weidman and George Abbott, give the impression that the creators deemed it necessary to patch a conventional plot structure into its groundbreaking unconventional one. The show dramatizes Fiorello LaGuardia's early political career, from his first run for U.S. Congress to his election as mayor of New York City. Running parallel to the plot are three romances. Two of these are lightly fictionalized depictions of the courtship between Fiorello and his first wife, Thea, who dies young, and then his second wife, Marie, his loyal secretary, who carries a torch for him from the start. But the musical also features a completely invented secondary love couple, Dora and Floyd, lighthearted foils to the tragic primary lovers. These made-up characters fulfill a marriage trope, bringing together two different social groups. Dora is a feisty shirtwaist factory worker picketing poor labor conditions, and Floyd is the cop assigned to contain the strike. In Fiorello, the romances take a back seat to the higher-stakes public political action. Although the female characters are obsessed with getting married, the audience does not get to witness any of the three weddings, saving room for more politics. Critic Stephen Holden wrote, quote, if the show's political savvy is bracingly realistic, its romantic conventions creak. Three mechanically resolved love stories are crammed into its plot. Two of the three we could do without, end quote. Indeed, producer Hal Prince later called the Dora and Floyd subplot a major flaw of the show. Furthermore, the romances are not well integrated into the score. Although there are several gorgeous sentimental ballads and desperate comic songs sung by women, there are no love duets. Fiorello, and indeed all of the male characters, only sing in political contexts, not the romantic scenes. The romances seem like excuses to have appealing women sing in the midst of a mostly male-dominated political comedy that is clearly the important part. Unlike Fiorello, romances are the lifeblood of Ben Franklin in Paris, with book and lyrics by Sidney Michaels and music by Mark Sandrich Jr. The 1964 comedy follows the witty and lascivious Franklin, a role created for Robert Preston, along with Franklin's two grandsons, young adult Temple and 7-year-old Benny. They arrive in Paris in 1776 to secure support and diplomatic relations for the American Revolution. There are two conventional couples, both fictionalized but based on real people. The primary lovers are Ben Franklin and a French countess, the invented character Diane de Vaudriac, and their romance is fictionalized in several surprising ways. In the published libretto, Sidney Michaels enumerated the historical facts and inaccuracies of the show, which very frequently happens in paratexts about the making of history musicals. He justifies two major changes. First, he reduced Franklin's age during his Paris residency. As Michaels explained, quote, "Historically, Ben Franklin was 70 plus years old, but dramatically no one would believe it, so the character is meant to be played in his romantic 50s, end quote. The second major change was that although the real Franklin reportedly had 4 romantic affairs in Paris, Michaels condensed these into one woman. He writes, quote, "4 physically consummated affairs carried on simultaneously at 70 plus or 50 might on the stage appear foolish," end quote. So Michaels took the less believable but true historical events and made them more conventional for a musical comedy. Like most primary love couples, Franklin and the Countess's relationship is not easy. Their affair plays the opening gambit of conditional love songs in which they deny their love. However, unlike in the majority of musical comedies, the leads do not end up together. The secondary love couple is more straightforward, as we expect. Temple Franklin falls in love with a poor but spirited Parisian hot chocolate seller, Janine, and soon they're engaged. Janine is a completely made-up character, but the romance is not entirely fabricated. Temple Franklin did reportedly have an affair in Paris with a married woman with whom he had a child. Janine's presence provides for a conventional secondary love couple whose relationship is more physical and less fraught than the primary couples. It also facilitates several sweeping romantic songs. In sum, the 2 invented romances in Ben Franklin and Paris serve to structure the musical into a conventional set of 2 contrasting love couples and provides the impetus for many of the show's songs. Of the musicals I'm discussing today, 1776, with music and lyrics by Sherman Edwards and book by Peter Stone, is the most devoted to historical accuracy. Both of its romances are historically based and occur between married couples, John and Abigail Adams and Thomas and Martha Jefferson. They're unconventional because musicals rarely begin with the couples already married, and the primary couple are never together in the same physical space. The fictionalization of the Adamses' love story comes not in altering history, but in the theatrical device of the husband and wife singing together in their imaginations through letters. This allows Sherman Edwards to include several duets that mix romance and politics and to bolster the veneer of historical accuracy by quoting from their archived correspondence. Thomas and Martha Jefferson's romance is also fictionalized to bring the couple together. In an early draft, Thomas, exhausted from the Constitutional Convention and drunk on too much wine, dreams his way into a vivid fantasy of Martha in a song called Woman's World. Although this dreamy number did not survive into the final version of the show, it suggests that the authors experimented with how to bring Martha into a love scene with her husband in Philadelphia, even though historically she was quite ill at home in Virginia. Before they gave up on the historical record and decided to summon a healthy Martha to sing the rousing He Plays the Violin, they instead brought Thomas to her in a drunken reverie. In Hamilton, fictionalization is also subtle and comes in service of creating a love triangle convention. Hamilton's romantic plot begins with Alexander's future wife, Eliza Schuyler, and her older sister, Angelica, both falling in love with him at first sight in the pair of songs Helpless, Satisfied. This sequence sets up a forbidden love between Alexander and Angelica that will thereafter be filled with unsatisfied longing. Taking a page from 1776, Miranda weaves quotations from the pair's letters into the lyrics. In reality, Angelica was already married by the time she and Alexander reportedly met, and historians can only speculate about the relationship beyond their flirtatious correspondence. But Miranda makes their yearning explicit, creating a love triangle convention to add intrigue and love duets, with Satisfied acting as a variation on the conditional love duet. Thus, all of these musicals manipulate romances to fit their unwieldy historical plots more comfortably into established genre conventions and expectations. In these shows, female characters are often used as props to both humanize and aggrandize the great men. Romances open a window to their private side and vulnerability. This humanizes otherwise larger-than-life figures and provides access to the imagined world of their emotions, encouraging audiences to relate to them and come to admire them through the eyes of their doting beloveds. Most of the main male characters are not conventional romantic leads. They're based on politicians who are not remembered for being handsome and dashing. Hamilton's flattering portrait notwithstanding. However, when the female characters love and desire these men, it proves to the audience that the men are charismatic and virile. In Fiorello, the presence of two beautiful women who fall in love with the future mayor makes the case that although he was not known for his good looks, LaGuardia had such extraordinary personal charisma that he won women just as he won voters. These love affairs also humanized LaGuardia, who would otherwise be too idealized. His relationships reveal his flaws and misjudgments. For example, Marie is obviously in love with Fiorello from the beginning, and his inability to see it and the thoughtless treatment of the poor woman shows his unhealthy, single-minded focus on his work. Ben Franklin in Paris and Hamilton work in the same way, using affairs both to heroize them as charismatic ladies' men and to humanize them when they fall short in their love lives. And John Adams's love songs give credence to his insistence that he still has his virility and can romp through Cupid's Grove with great agility. Each of these musicals provides the glimpses into the boudoir that our allonormative society presumes audiences crave. In short, these moments use women to show the audience how to feel about the great men. The few great women musicals also fictionalize romances, but rather than heroizing their main characters, they cast those women as manipulative and promiscuous, and rather than humanizing them, they make them out to be these exceptionally libidinous creatures. Their affairs are carnal, scandalous, and destructive. We find the roots of this in the discipline of historical biography. The most successful history musical centered on a woman is Evita. Tim Rice and Andrew Lloyd Webber invent romances to depict Eva Peron as a manipulative Jezebel who deploys her sexuality in pursuit of power, conducting advantageous affairs with a revolving door of ever more powerful men until she becomes the First Lady of Argentina and an international icon. But none of this is necessarily true. Victoria Allison calls the historical Eva Peron's promiscuity an unsubstantiated allegation that was a popular trope in the early biographies on which Tim Rice based Evita. In the musical, her affairs don't humanize her, but reduce her to a saint-whore dichotomy. The following year, Onward Victoria opened and closed on the same night on Broadway. With a book and lyrics by feminist academics Charlotte Anker and Irene Rosenberg and music by Keith Herman, it tells the story of Victoria Woodhull, the leader of the American women's suffrage movement and the first woman to run for president in 1872. Like Ben Franklin in Paris, Onward Victoria is a little bit political, but mostly a sex comedy. Like Evita, it puts the emphasis on the protagonist's avid sex life and her use of sex to manipulate men. As with Evita, the salacious tone echoes the early biographies of Woodhull, which dwelled on rumors of her sexual exploits. Onward Victoria attempted a more positive view of women's sexual liberation than Evita. Much like the male-centric shows discussed here, the men who fictionally fall in love with Woodhull help to define her as charismatic and desirable, but there's also a lot of sensationalizing, though not explicitly shaming, her sex life. Onward Victoria was feminist for its time, but in our patriarchal culture, Woodhull's character still carried a negative connotation, as she did for Frank Rich, the critic, who wrote that, quote, "the heroine comes off as a pioneering vulgarian." When musicals that are promoted and received as true stories fictionalize romances, it sends several messages. It reveals an attitude that romances are entertaining, but they aren't historically significant. It doesn't matter if they're accurate, since romances are thought to have scant influence on the workings of history, at least the kind of history that has been deemed important. These love stories are instead a tool for the audience to get to know the famous men as people, at least as the musical's creators wish to portray them. This tendency does the work of the patriarchy, and women bear the brunt. The frequency with which female characters are fictionalized or entirely made up to dote on the main male character reinscribes the assumption that women's stories are relevant to history mainly as auxiliaries to men. Furthermore, the idea that romances are compulsory in musicals perpetuates allonormativity and precludes the possibility of telling other kinds of stories, particularly about historical women. Thank you so much.